Recently released documents in the Idaho 4 case reveal something chilling. Bryan Kohberger, the man who pleaded guilty to killing 4 University of Idaho students, cementing his place among the most infamous student killers, has an obsession with serial killer Danny Rowling, otherwise known as the Gainesville Ripper. Investigators in Idaho believe Coberger may have studied Rowling's murders in detail, possibly using them as a blueprint for the killings at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. For this reason, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at Danny Rowling's modus operandi and see which elements Coberger may have borrowed from Rowling's playbook. We know Coberger was keen to learn from other criminals because he put that Reddit survey out for a project at DeSales University. Some of the questions on the survey were: 1. Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this point. 2. How did you travel to and enter the location where the crime occurred? 3. After arriving, what steps did you take prior to locating the victim or target, i.e. person or object? Please detail your thoughts and feelings. Why did you choose that victim or target over others? So it's not hard to imagine that Coberger likely took some tips from Danny Rowling. Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Hello, my bed crimers. I hope you're having a great day. One favor, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more chilling true crime stories. Those are 2 free ways you can help me, and they really do make a difference. And if you want to support my ad-free channel, please consider a Patreon membership at just $1.99. It's oodles less than your morning Joe. Danny Rowling's crimes were so brutal and bizarre that they actually inspired the opening scene of the 1996 horror classic Scream. Think masked intruder, a nighttime home invasion, young student victims. All of it traces back to the real-life nightmare that began in Gainesville, Florida in early August of 1990. Danny Harold Rowling grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, in a home where violence was a constant simmering threat. His father, James, a Korean War veteran and decorated Shreveport police officer, was domineering and often abusive. Danny's mother, Claudia, like her 2 sons, Danny and his younger brother, Keith, lived in constant fear. Even the simplest, most benign things could trigger James. For example, breathing in some way that displeased him could get the offender pummeled with fists. Think major prick. One time, Danny's mom had to go to the hospital after hubby James forced her to cut herself with a razor blade. Claudia, like others who suffered DV at the hands of a spouse or partner, made repeated attempts to leave James, but she always returned shortly afterward. Maybe that was down to financial issues, maybe something else. As for Danny, his father let him know from a very young age that he wasn't wanted. James targeted Danny for every type of abuse imaginable. One day, Daddy James pinned Danny down on the ground, he handcuffed him, and then he had his buddies on the force take his son away because, get this, Danny was an embarrassment. And it gets much worse than that. Sicko James is said to have beaten the family dog to the point where the poor animal ended up dying in Danny's arms. Yeah, that would traumatize you. And I would have to say, James Rowling, the dad, must have been a psycho, which probably destined his son, Danny, to become an antisocial, violent human being. Not everybody in that circumstance will turn out that way, but we know that some of them do. By his teens, Rowling was breaking into homes, peeping through windows, and collecting weapons, especially sharp ones, if you know what I mean. Now, one thing he learned as he honed his criminal skills was to watch the house and/or the victim before striking. Danny would find homes with wooded areas in the back. Camouflaged in the trees at night, he'd study the movements and routines of his targeted victim or victims. He also always made it a point to enter through a rear door. And as a young man, Danny was arrested several times for robberies in Georgia and Alabama. Sounds like he couldn't keep his sticky fingers off other people's stuff, and he didn't want to have to work to get that stuff. One of Danny's problems was trouble fitting in, and he also couldn't seem to hold down a job. Well, yeah, he was probably stealing cash out of the register. At one point, Rowling worked as a waiter at a Pancho's restaurant in Bossier City, Louisiana. I love Louisiana, especially New Orleans and the Cajun culture. I'm getting the impression that Rowling suffered from the same ick factor that Bryan Kohberger has, the one that makes people, especially females, not want to hang out with him or date him. Hearing all this about Danny Rowling, you have to wonder if Bryan Kohberger took all those nighttime trips to Moscow, Idaho, 23. First, to find the right house to attack. Based on Danny Rowling's cues, Kohberger may have been scouting for a house on a lot with a wooded area in the back, as well as an easy-to-access rear door. Think of the sliding glass door leading into the kitchen at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. The house would also have to house the type of victims Kohberger was after. Pretty young females, preferably popular blondes who wouldn't want to date him. I heard Chris McDonough of the Interview Room say that he felt that Kohberger actually targeted the house and not necessarily a particular victim living inside of it. And we know now from the prosecutor that investigators were not able to find any clear connections between Kohberger and one or more of the victims, at least nothing that would prove he was targeting, say, Madison Mogen or Kaylee Goncalves. So maybe Kohberger didn't target one of the victims, and instead he targeted a house that would meet the elements that his hero, Danny Rowling, looked for. Remember 1122 King Road, where the Idaho 4 victims died, had a wooded area behind it, and Kaylee Goncalves once saw somebody out there watching her as she let her dog Murphy out. Can you say creeper? And apparently Murphy began running to that tree line at some point and not coming back when called. It was almost like Murphy had a personality change at some point. So you have to wonder if Kohberger was hiding out there in the trees with dog treats in hand, maybe trying to befriend Murphy so that Murphy wouldn't attack him once he entered the house. I think it's likely. Honestly, these creeps get just as much of a thrill out of planning their crimes, fantasizing about them, doing the surveillance, as they get from carrying out the actual crime. We know that Kohberger studied serial killers, and he was very interested in learning about each one's modus operandi. I think both Rowling and Kohberger understood the power of planning and patience, waiting for the right day and time and the right victims. Now I want to take you through Danny Rowling's crimes to see what Kohberger may have gleaned from them. We have to travel back in time to 1989 in Shreveport, Louisiana. It's Saturday, November 4th, and 55-year-old Tom Grissom is busy grilling steaks for dinner. His house just happens to back up onto trees, and it has a rear entrance. Check, check. Tom's 24-year-old daughter, Julie, is visiting for the weekend, and she's busy getting ready in her bedroom for a friend's wedding reception later that night. Tom's 8-year-old grandson, Sean, who is also visiting, is planted in front of the TV in the living room, and he's likely waiting for Grandpa to say dinner's ready. Unbeknownst to these three precious souls, a monster is lurking outside in the trees behind the house, and he's waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Sometime between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., Danny Rowling makes his entrance. It's impossible to pinpoint the time because all the witnesses did not live to tell. Rowling enters the home, and he wastes no time wreaking havoc with the K-bar he's brandishing. The same weapon Bryan Kohberger will use 32 years later in Moscow, Idaho. A bloodbath ensues. Tom, Julie, and Sean are all stabbed to death. Julie has the misfortune of being essayed before being killed and then posed in a macabre manner. She's found with her hair fanned out above her head on the bed. When Tom Grissom fails to deliver his grandson Sean home as planned on Monday, November 6th, and when Tom also fails to answer the calls to the house, Sean's mother calls the police for a welfare check. Now, here's something really strange. The cops ask a neighbor to check if any of the Grissom's doors are open. And at 8:45 a.m. on that Monday, a neighbor opens the door to the utility room off the garage and stumbles across a horrifying scene. Tom is motionless and he's slumped against the door. He has stab wounds to his chest and back. When the police arrive, they find 8-year-old Sean slumped over in the living room with a stab wound straight through from his back out his chest. Julie, who I think was Danny Rowling's primary victim, is found nude in the bedroom and partially hanging off the bed. She has 3 stab wounds to her back, but is found face up. Oddly, the perpetrator has applied vinegar to her body to sort of clean it, and then he posed it. As I said, he fanned her hair out in a very deliberate manner. Now, the cops find no signs of forced entry. However, there are some signs of a struggle. The police are pretty much shocked and baffled. They're not used to this type of thing, and they don't know it yet, but the perpetrator, Danny Rowling, actually lives just 10 minutes away. Danny had moved back in with his parents, even that crazy dad of his, James, in 1989. Now, before that, Danny had spent most of the 1980s in prison. One of his crimes was robbing a Kroger's grocery store. But just 6 months after the Grissom murders, Danny, who was then 35 years old, suddenly fled his parents' house after an unbelievably violent argument with his father, James. So this argument took place roughly 6 months after the Grissoms' deaths on a sultry evening in May. Danny and James get into a heated argument, and Danny ends up shooting his father in the head. And you gotta wonder, did he use his father's own weapon? Remember, James was a police officer. Now get this, the argument reportedly ensued after James told his son Danny to roll his car windows up because it was raining outside. Apparently, Danny didn't like being told what to do. So now the tables were turned in the Rowling household. Danny, the grown son, was now the one exploding at his father over something frivolous and stupid. Later that same night, Danny broke into a nearby home and he stole $21 from a terrified couple. He tells them he needs money to get to Dallas, Texas. The next morning, Danny's car is found abandoned in the Motel 6 parking lot on Monkhouse Drive. The cops figure out that he didn't check into the hotel. At some point, Danny takes a Greyhound bus to Florida, where he pitches a tent in the woods. Now, I'm thinking maybe money was tight, or perhaps Danny preferred living away in the woods, away from other people, or maybe, with his crime history, nobody would rent to him. Who knows? Fast forward 3 months to August of 1990. Gainesville, Florida is buzzing with returning students. Danny Rowling is still sleeping in the woods, but he's waiting for the right moment, the right residence, and the right victims. On August 24th, the right moment comes around. Rowling breaks into an apartment. 2 university freshmen have just moved in, 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell. Rowling finds Powell asleep on the downstairs sofa. He stands over her, but he doesn't wake her up. Instead, he heads upstairs where he finds Larson asleep in bed. First, he tapes her mouth shut to keep her quiet. Sonia, of course, puts up a fight, but she's no match for the K-bar he's holding. Sounds so much like what happened to Kaylee Goncalves and Xana Kernodle when they had the absolute misfortune of running into Coberger in their own house. Rowling then heads downstairs. He tapes Christina Powell's mouth shut, ties her hands up behind her back, and threatens her with the K-bar as he cuts her clothing off. Yeah, this was one of his particular moves. He liked using that knife to cut the victim's clothing off. I suspect he enjoyed watching the fear as he did that. He then essays her and he forces her face down on the floor. Next, he lifts the K-bar and he brings it down into her back 5 times. After unaliving Powell, Rowling heads back upstairs and he essays the deceased Sonia. Talk about a freaking weirdo. Ted Bundy was another whack job who got off on necrophilia. We're talking the sickest of the sick here. Now, before he leaves, Rowling poses both women's bodies in provocative positions. And then he has the audacity to shower in their bathroom. Clearly, he had no fear, which supports the idea that he was a psychopath and he wasn't worried about getting caught. The next day, August 25th, Danny was still jonesing for more victims. I guess he had a taste of blood in his mouth. The apartment he settles on is that of 18-year-old Christine Hoyt, a chemistry student at Santa Fe College. This time, Rowling pries open a sliding glass door with a screwdriver. Krista isn't home, but that's no problem. Rowling waits for her in her living room. Between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m., Hoyt returns after playing racquetball with a friend. At some point, Danny makes his presence known, and Krista Hoyt finds herself unable to escape. Danny places her in a chokehold and then uses duct tape to gag her mouth and bind her wrists together behind her back. Next, he leads her into the bedroom where he once again uses his K-bar to cut her clothes off. He then essays her. Finally, he forces Krista to lie face down on the bed. He then uses that K-bar on her back and he ruptures her aorta. But he's not done. He flips her body over and he slices her abdomen open from her pubic bone to her breastbone. I can't help thinking about Kaylee Goncalves, whose body sustained 34 stab wounds, some of which the coroner described as gouges. Rowling then flees to his campsite in the woods, but once there, he realizes he doesn't have his wallet. Thinking he may have left it at Hoyt's apartment, he returns to the crime scene. This makes me wonder about Coberger, who left the K-bar sheath behind and then drove back to the crime scene house later in the morning. You have to wonder, was Coberger contemplating going back inside to retrieve the leather sheath and possibly to wreak some more havoc? Danny Rowling goes back into the apartment and he takes his horror up another level. Using his K-bar, he removes Christine's head. He then poses her body in a seated position at the edge of the bed, and he places her head on a bookshelf facing the body. What a sicko. Can you imagine the fright whoever discovered the scene must have felt? Danny Rowling was determined to make it as shocking as possible for whoever stumbled upon it or heard about it. That was one of his goals. He enjoyed sowing the seeds of fear in the entire community, causing widespread panic in the hearts of young students. He got off on that part of it. Now, by this point, the murders were all over the news. And yes, students in the area were absolutely freaking terrified. Some of them dropped out and returned to their parents' houses. Others decided to sleep together in groups, much like they did in Moscow, Idaho. Others transferred to other colleges. 2 days later, on August 27th of 1990, Rowling breaks into a unit at the Gatorwood Apartments near the University of Florida campus. The apartment is shared by 23-year-old Tracy Paulus and her male roommate, 23-year-old Manny Taboda. Once again, Rowling uses a screwdriver to pry open a sliding glass door. This sounds so similar to the Idaho 4 case, except I don't think Coberger had to break in because it's been said that the girls often left the rear sliding glass door into the kitchen open. Rowling finds Manny Taboda asleep in a bed. A struggle ensues, and of course, Manny ends up deceased. And yes, this reminds me of Ethan Chapin. Ethan was also asleep in bed when he was unalived by Bryan Kohberger, who was also holding a sharp K-bar. In both cases, we have victims attacked in their most vulnerable state, home asleep in the wee hours of the night or early morning. Hearing the commotion, roommate Tracy, much like it's believed Xana Kernodle did, goes down the hall to see what's going on. Tracy, of course, sees this strange guy Rowling and what he's doing, and she runs like hell to get inside her bedroom and try and lock the door. Now, unlike Xana, Tracy is able to close her bedroom door. However, Rowling isn't going to let that stop him. He breaks through the door. And boy, does this sound like a scene out of a scary movie. Scream. Once inside, Rowling tapes Tracy's mouth and wrists, and then he proceeds to cut off her clothing. He essays her, then he turns her over, and he stabs her 3 times in the back. I wonder why he always turned the victims over like that and injured them through the back. Did he find this easier? Did he not want to look into their faces as he committed these acts? Finally, Rowling poses her body, but he leaves her roommate Manny in the position in which he died. I'm thinking maybe Rowling had zero interest in male victims. It's clear that he was sexually motivated, which makes me wonder if Coberger planned to essay one of the victims, or more, but was unable to. If it was indeed Maddy Mogen he went there for, he was likely surprised to find Kaylee in bed with her, and that would have thrown off his plan. I heard Dr. Gary Brucato say that it's possible Coberger became infuriated when Kaylee messed up his essay plans, and that could explain why she was attacked so many times and why her face was subjected to blunt force trauma. Now, aside from Manny, all of Rowling's victims were petite females, they were Caucasian, and they were dark-haired with brown eyes, and all of that was just like Rowling's mother, Claudia. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. The bodies of Tracy Paulus and Manuel Taboda are discovered at the Gatorwood Apartments 2 days after the bodies of Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, and Krista Hoyt were found, murdered and mutilated in 2 separate locations near the University of Florida campus. The cops quickly noted similarities among the crimes. The killer targeted female students, used a K-bar to unalive them, essayed the victims, and then positioned the victims' bodies in lewd positions before leaving. Soon the authorities determined that all 5 murders were indeed connected, and the Gainesville student community panicked. A lot of people headed down to the sheriff's office apparently to obtain a concealed weapons permit, and many of them went out and they bought mace. So the first 3 murders spawned a massive investigation, including 75 state and federal agents. After the bodies of Paulus and Taboda were found, Florida's governor sent an additional 50 state troopers and investigators to assist. At first, the Gainesville police had no leads for any of these crimes, but eventually they identified two suspects, neither of whom is Danny Rowling. One is a guy, 20 years old, named Edward Humphrey, and Humphrey is a University of Florida student who suffers from mental illness and who likes to carry sharp objects, if you know what I mean. He was previously convicted of felony assault against his grandmother and was held in custody for 5 months until a grand jury failed to indict him on the charges, citing insufficient evidence. Also, he had lived in the Gatorwood apartments where Tracy and Manny were killed, and he'd been evicted due to fights with roommates. He was an all-around wacko. Humphrey's photo was shown repeatedly by media outlets, and it made for a very scary image. And that's because his face was riddled with scars. And the scars were not from a sharp object, which I thought at first when I saw them, but instead were from a car accident. Now, the authorities would later clear Humphrey of all charges, and once he started taking medication for his manic depression, he actually managed to graduate in 1994 from a local college. The other suspect was also eventually cleared. So now, Louisiana police, having heard of these student murders in Gainesville, Florida, and the perpetrator's proclivity for posing the bodies, alerted authorities in Florida to their unsolved triple crime from November of 1989, the Grissom murders. Detectives noted similarities between the Gainesville murders and those of Tom Grissom, his daughter Julie, and of course his grandson Sean. The posing of Julie's body, tape residue found on the victims as well, and vinegar being used to cleanse the bodies. Don Maines, an investigator with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, subsequently traveled to Shreveport, Louisiana in November. Maines had tested the bodily fluids from the victims in Gainesville, and he found that the perpetrator had type B blood. 3 months earlier, in August of 1990, Jurassic heard a story about a string of murders in Florida, and the report made her think about Danny Rowling, whom she'd met in Louisiana. Jurassic remembered deeply disturbing things that Danny had said, both to her and to her then-husband, Stephen Dobbin. Jurassic said this of Danny Rowling, quote, "He'd come over every night for a while, and then one night Stephen came in and he goes, 'He's got to go,' end quote." She also said that Dobbin told her that Rowling had said that he had a problem. Jurassic explained how she reacted to her husband's words. "I said, 'What kind of problem?' And Stephen said, 'He likes to stick knives into people,' end quote." Jurassic said she dismissed these comments because she didn't want to believe that Rowling could be responsible for the crimes in Shreveport. Rowling had also told her, though, quote, "One day I'm going to leave this town, Shreveport, and I'm going to go where the girls are beautiful and I can just lay in the sun and watch beautiful women all day," end quote. News of the Gainesville murders haunted Jurassic, so she finally called the police in November based on her feelings about Rowling's connections to the crimes in both cities. She said, quote, "It would not let me rest. One day I picked up the phone, I called Crime Stoppers, and I said, 'I think there's one guy you all need to investigate, Danny Rowling,' end quote." Investigators jumped on the tip, and they quickly found Danny Rowling. It turns out he'd been arrested on September 7th of 1990 for robbing a supermarket in Ocala, Florida. That crime went down 10 days after the bodies of Paulus and Tabota were found. The investigators found Rowling in the Marion County Jail, 40 miles south of Gainesville. Once investigators determined that Rowling had type B blood, like the suspect in both the Gainesville and Shreveport crimes, They were confident that they might have their guy. Seeing that he had multiple convictions as well for armed robberies, investigators realized Rowling might also be behind a bank robbery that went down on the same day that Krista Hoyt's body was found. The investigators were able to look at the evidence locker for Rowling, where they found a gun, a screwdriver, a bag of money, and a cassette player. They also found tools matching marks left at the Gainesville crime scenes. Investigators also found the small camp in the woods where Rowling had been living. It was in a wooded area near apartment complexes that were mostly filled with college students. At the campsite, investigators discovered audio diaries that Rowling had made, in which he alluded to his crimes. Later, it was discovered that on August 5th of 1990, Rowling broke into the home of a woman named Janet Frake in Sarasota, Florida. He bound her and gagged her with duct tape while he essayed her. Somehow, Frake got lucky because Rowling did not unalive her. Finally, in November of 1991, Rowling was charged with 5 counts of you-know-what, red rum. His trial took place nearly 4 years after the crimes in Gainesville. He claimed his motive was to become a superstar, similar to Ted Bundy. Now here is where I definitely think Bryan Kohberger took a cue from Danny Rowling. In 1994, before Rowling's trial could even get underway, Danny suddenly and without warning pleaded guilty to all the charges. Subsequently, State Attorney Rod Smith presented the penalty phase of the prosecution. During his trial, Danny Rowling's trial, Court TV conducted an interview with Rowling's mother from her home, during which his father, James, could be heard shouting off camera, "What's the saying? A leopard can't change its spots?" He also got very lucky. Yeah, the dad survived the gunshot wound to the head. On April 20th of 1994, Rowling was sentenced to death. He was also diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and paraphilia. FYI, if you don't know, paraphilia is an experience of recurring or intense sexual arousal to atypical objects, places, situations, fantasies, behaviors, or individuals. It has also been defined as a sexual interest in anything other than a legally consenting human partner. Shortly before he was executed in Florida for the crimes in Gainesville, Rowling finally admitted that he was indeed the perpetrator of the Shreveport crimes. He handed his spiritual advisor, Reverend Mike Hudspeth, and the Florida police a handwritten confession and an apology. Rowling enjoyed a last meal of lobster tail. I'm assuming they gave him some butter with that. He sang a gospel hymn, but made no statements immediately before his execution, which was witnessed by many of his victims' relatives. He was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 25th, 2006, after the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a last-ditch appeal, and he was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. Bryan Kohberger, I'm sad to say, seems to have taken a lot of moves from his sicko hero, Danny Rowling. Kohberger suddenly took a plea deal and admitted committing the crimes at 1122 King Road, which ended up getting the DP taken off the table and preventing the victims' families from having a trial in which they could confront him and hear all the evidence. This really upset Kaylee Goncalves' family as well as Xana Kernodle's. Perhaps Coberger read that Danny Rowling pleading guilty caused additional pain to the victims' families, and that was also behind Kohberger's plea deal. Other similarities between Rowling and Kohberger include the following. Kohberger, we know, used a K-bar in the 2022 crime, the same weapon of choice of Danny Rowling. Coberger also entered the home in Moscow at night via a sliding glass door in the back. Rowling targeted young college students in a college town. And like Rowling, Coberger carried out his crime in the early morning hours when his victims were all mostly asleep. Coberger, like Rowling, also surveilled the victim's house multiple times prior to the crime. In addition, the house Coberger selected had a wooded area in the back, an area from which he likely surveilled the house. And like Rowling, Coberger went into the homes and rapidly harmed his victims multiple times. And Coberger, we know, is socially awkward, just like Danny Rowling.
Rules say I have to give Mr. Rowling an opportunity to have a say. You have anything you want to say, Mr. Rowling?
Well, sir. If it please the court, could I address the court?
Sure, say whatever you want to say.
Thank you. I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you, but it was hard to say. I couldn't touch you. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together.
Excuse me, Mr. Rowling.
Down the
Mr.
path
Rowling.
you choose
Mr. Rowling.
to follow.
Mr. Rowling.
Tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together. What were my words? All my tears run together, baby, just like rain.
On July 18th, 1990, Danny Harold Rowling walked into an Army-Navy store. It was in Tallahassee, Florida. It was near the bus station. He made a purchase. He paid about $34 plus tax. He bought an item. The item he purchased was a Marine Corps K-bar knife, just like this one. In a very real sense, that was the first step in a plan that became an episode that will forever be remembered as the Gainesville student murders. It resulted in the deaths, as a result of the rampage of Danny Harold Rowling, of 5 people, young students in this community: Sonia Larson, Christine Powell, Krista Hoyt, Manuel Taboda, and Tracy Paulus. For years, most of you, like everyone else in the community who's ever watched anything about this case, expected that a day would come in which someone would stand accused of that crime before a court. The victims' families, the community, the judge, the attorneys, and a jury, though surely you didn't expect to be on that jury, would make a decision about who did it and how it was done. That day never happened, and it will never occur, because Danny Rowling, on the day when the guilt phase of these proceedings was scheduled to begin, came into court and admitted that he was guilty to each of the 11 crimes in the indictment that arose out of these events. It never happened because he chose on that day to admit to these crimes rather than face the mountains of evidence that the state had compiled on the issue of guilt. So from that day forward, the question of guilt has been, as we told you in jury selection, as the court has reminded you, and we will remind you forever, closed. Pain, to which we will provide you evidence that he later bragged of saying, "Take the pain, bitch, take the pain." The state's going to show you that after he killed her, he took the tape off her hands, he took the tape off her mouth. He went over to the refrigerator, and he got some fruit, an apple and a banana, and he ate it. Now we know that because we've got evidence that we'll present to you that he admits to it. And secondly, we know it because we took that evidence and matched it against photographs that we took of the apartment. And at that apartment, you're going to find the very fruit he recalls so vividly eating after he had killed both girls, after he had raped Christine. He goes back upstairs. He untapes Sonia. He poses her body. He goes back downstairs. He poses the other body of Christina. He's got him just right. He leaves. Pain, to which we will provide you evidence that he later bragged of saying, "Take the pain, bitch, take the pain."